Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our committee information gathering meeting. My name is Caroline Bell. I'm the study director from the National Academy of Sciences. For all of those that are joining us online today, thank you for the interest in our new study. We ask that you please keep yourself muted. We will have some time for questions at the end of each speaker. Our committee co-chairs will be moderating the sessions and we'll prioritize committee questions. But if there's time, we'll get to questions from the public as well. And if you do raise your hand and ask a question, please turn your camera on if you're able, just for a sense of community. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Michelle Conrad, our committee co-chair.
Great, thank you. And welcome everyone to the committee's information gathering session, where we're going to hear more about the California current ecosystem, tribal treaty fishing rights, and U.S. Coast Guard operations on the West Coast, as well as offshore renewable energy development on the West Coast and other topics related to the statement of task. I'm Michelle Conrad. I'm one of the committee co-chairs, and with me is Keith Michelle, the other co-chair. We have some committee members here in the room with us in Irvine, and we have the other committee members joining us online. So I will pause and see. Keith, did you want to say anything this morning?
Nothing.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Kelly Andrews, who is giving us a presentation this morning on the California current ecosystem. Kelly is with the NOAA Fisheries Northwest Fisheries Science Center. He's been with them since 2003. He's a fishery research scientist, has been working on fishes and elasmobranchs in Puget Sound and along the West Coast. He's a member of the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team. So welcome, Dr. Andrews.
Hi, thanks a lot, Michelle. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. And are you seeing my screen in full effect? Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. As Michelle said, my name is Kelly Andrews, and I am a member of NOAA's California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team. I'm really happy to be here today and to share some details about the California current ecosystem, and also some information and some recent analyses and results that directly relate to assessing potential interactions between fisheries and new offshore ocean use sectors, such as offshore renewable energy across the US West Coast. So today I'm going to start off with some key information about the California current ecosystem, and then I'm going to get into some marine spatial planning tools that have been developed for the West Coast related to fisheries and new ocean use sectors. Then I'm going to talk about how historically measured interactions between fisheries and offshore renewable energy might differ if we consider future environmental conditions. And then I'll end with some high-level thoughts on data gaps and uncertainty and some analyses that are underway to try to address some of that work. Okay, the California current marine ecosystem is a highly productive coastal ecosystem that extends across the entire US West Coast. The ecosystem supports a large number of important fisheries and other activities and provides services for tens of millions of people living along the West Coast. The California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment is an interdisciplinary research effort led by NOAA scientists along the US West Coast. And our goal is to provide science support for ecosystem-based management of the California current. We conceptualize the California current as a social ecological system, which explicitly acknowledges linkages and feedbacks between the human and biophysical systems at multiple scales. One of our goals is to measure the status and trends of these different components and how disturbances or different management strategies might affect interactions between and among various components. Each year, we try to summarize the system as best as we can and present a report to the Pacific Fishery Management Council. That report informs upcoming decisions on fishing seasons and provides a lot of context for all of the fisheries operating up and down the West Coast. The report provides a snapshot of ocean conditions, population abundance, and health indices for key taxa, species, and habitat, and also presents information on fisheries landings and several indices related to the health and condition of various fishing communities up and down the West Coast. It gives short-term forecasts and longer-term projections of how conditions across the ecosystem may evolve during the current year and beyond into the future. The infographic that you see on the screen here is sort of a high level slide of highlights that are included in the report. And throughout this talk, you'll see several dinosaur focused QR codes. And that'll take you to different sections of either our report or our website or different studies that we have going on. Now, one of the key oceanographic drivers that you'll see in this set of highlights and also throughout our report is related to upwelling in the California current. This is one of the key oceanographic drivers in the California current. Upwelling is an important driver of productivity across the California current and is basically the result of shifts in wind patterns in the spring, in which strong northerly winds plus the rotation of the earth help push surface currents and surface waters offshore, which then allows for deeper, colder, more nutrient-rich waters to rise up and fuel phytoplankton and zooplankton growth. This productivity then feeds populations of krill and squid, sardines, and other species that are then subsequently fed upon by larger fishes, seabirds, and marine mammals. And this really forms the foundation for the success of many West Coast fisheries. I'm going to give you one specific example of the importance of upwelling and how it can be seen, how it was observed in the winter of 2024. We had an unusually strong El Nino in the winter of 2024. And then as that El Nino began to decay, atmospheric winds shifted and strong upwelling began to transform the system to cooler, more productive waters. And you can see that transition right along that green arrow or green line that happens right around April. Can you see my cursor online by chance? Maybe not.
No.
Yeah, now you can. Yeah.
Oh, now you can. Okay, perfect. So right around April is when we start to see that decay of El Nino and this flourish of cold upwelled water. Now, biologically, we saw a rapid response from what we call northern copepods in the California current. We describe these copepods as cheeseburgers. Cheeseburger copepods because they are extremely high in oils and fat as compared to their southern counterparts, which are also present in the California current ecosystem. But those southern species have much lower levels of oils and fats, and we sort of liken them to the celery copepods. So here, as you can see, kind of in late April into May, and then ongoing throughout the summer, you can see this rapid increase of these northern copepod species right off of the Newport line in Oregon, right around 44 to 45 degrees latitude north. So you really see the strong response of copepods responding to this upwelling. And that really, sets the stage for the success of many of our fisheries up and down the West Coast. Here you can see examples of time series of the status and trends in annual landings for each of the major fisheries management groupings that we have along the West Coast. These time series are presented in our annual report, and you can also find indices of revenue. You can see examples of participation networks in that report. These networks really describe how fishers operate across multiple fisheries throughout the up and down the West Coast. And then we also present indices of community vulnerability and diversification indices. So if you haven't visited or seen that report or seen the presentation of the report to the council, definitely take advantage of that through the work that you have going on here. Okay, now similar to the upwelling to copepod story, if we really want to determine if and or how any of our West Coast fisheries might be impacted by new ocean use sectors such as offshore energy, it's going to be really important to determine which ecosystem drivers and components are most likely to be affected and which ones have direct or indirect connections with fisheries. And so many of the potential interactions between offshore energy and fisheries, we tend to characterize into two main buckets. The first bucket of interactions are location specific. They're related to exactly where development has been sited. These interactions are mostly related to effects caused by the spatial overlap in the distribution of species and fisheries with these new areas of development. This overlap might also affect species foraging, their movement patterns, and their reproductive behaviors in these areas that subsequently affect the operation of fisheries up and down the West Coast. The second bucket of interactions are related to impacts on the ecosystem caused by the physical effects of new infrastructure in the water. And so, for example, does removing wind energy from wind turbines, does that removal of energy from the system alter downstream winds enough to affect upwelling, which we already know is really important to the system? Do the platforms in the water, do these football-sized stadium platforms alter currents and fronts and other habitat characteristics? And if any of those physical conditions are changed, how are the nutrients and other physical variables altered? Ultimately, these physical effects are connected to fisheries via impacts on pelagic and benthic habitats and on targeted bycatch and protected species abundance and distributions. And finally, no conceptual model thinking about potential future impacts of new ocean uses would be complete if we didn't think about how climate variation and future ocean conditions might alter any and all of these interactions and their resulting impacts ultimately on fisheries. Okay, in the second part here, I'm going to focus on that first bucket of interactions and talk about 3 spatial planning tools that can help identify, avoid, and minimize negative interactions. So one recent effort examined spatial trade-offs between fisheries and offshore wind development using both a coast-wide approach and a state-by-state approach in order to identify optimal locations for offshore wind development across 3 different planning goals. And those planning goals, there we go, based on, are your goals to be, fisheries centric? Do you want a balanced approach, or do you want an offshore centric focused goal? Now here you can see the spatial variation in the levelized cost of energy for offshore wind up and down the West Coast. And you can see those comparisons to the present value across the top 8 commercial fisheries target species across the West Coast. This information is then put into a trade-off analysis, and the results tend to show a variety of optimal spatial locations for offshore wind development, depending on whether you're taking a coast-wide approach, which is this region-wide panels, and whether your goals are fisheries-centric, balanced, or wind-centric. And we also, and this manuscript also targets 2 different time horizons in 2030 and in 2024. So this analysis could really help sort of initial scoping efforts to identify trade-offs across both traditional and new ocean use sectors. The second tool that I'm going to talk about is the tool that BOEM used to identify suitable areas for offshore wind development off the coast of Oregon. And here they used a model that was developed by NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Sciences. And this model is made up of 6 different submodels that incorporate spatial data from a wide variety of ecosystem components. And so those ecosystem components are broken into these 6 different submodels related to the development of wind and wind resources. There's a fisheries submodel, there's a natural resources submodel, an industry and operations submodel, and then a constraint submodel that mostly deals with Department of Defense information and Coast Guard information. And so we participated in this process and helped identify spatial data for 8 different commercial fisheries and 1 recreational fishery across this area of the Oregon coastline. So we quantified fishing effort for each of these fisheries using logbook information, and then use these individual layers to calculate a combined suitability map across the 2 call areas. And in this map, you can see that, or what you see is that the warmer areas, the warmer colors in the map identify areas that are relatively important to fisheries and thus get a lower suitability score. So those warmer colored areas are less suitable for offshore wind development because they're important according to this information, and they're more important for commercial fisheries. These fisheries data were then combined with those other submodels data. And what we found is that the final selection process that BOEM went through, it really seems like the fisheries data was pretty influential in that final selection process in their suitability modeling. Okay, the final example of sort of trade-off analyses that I'm going to show you here is done by colleagues at Cal Poly, and this was done sort of at this really fine scale. This was done at the scale of the Morro Bay wind energy area and the 3 lease areas within that wind energy area. So this analysis really sought to identify how different spatial arrangements of turbines could be optimized across energy and fisheries values, as well as across the vulnerability of seabirds and cetacean species. So even at this relatively fine spatial scale, there are tools that can help us identify, avoid, and minimize impacts to various ecosystem components, including fisheries. Okay, in this next section, I'm going to sort of turn my attention to some work that we're doing to examine how our perceptions of impacts to fisheries might be different if we consider dynamic ocean conditions in the future. And so kind of going back to our conceptual model again, we're sort of highlighting this one route through the conceptual model. And we're going to focus on how shifts in fisheries target species distributions brought on by changing ocean conditions might alter our perception of risk to fisheries. In this study, we focused on three trawl fisheries, three groundfish trawl fisheries. There are two bottom trawl fisheries, which you see in the left and the middle panel, based on the primary species that are targeted in each of those fisheries. And then you also see the third is the midwater rockfish trawl fishery. Now, we started by calculating fishing footprints for each of these fisheries for each port that the fishery lands fish to. And so those fishing footprints are color coordinated with the port of landing. And you can begin to see sort of the overlap with some of these fishing footprints and 4 proposed areas of offshore wind development. At the time of this analysis, there were 2 call areas off the southern coast of Oregon and 2 wind energy areas off the coast of California. And you can see those all outlined in dark black there. We then use these footprints to calculate the proportion of overlap with these proposed areas of development for each port, each fishery, and in each year from 1994 to 2020. These levels of overlap were then used as a measure of exposure in our risk assessment. Those measures of exposure are along the x-axis, and so that represents the proportion of footprints that were overlapping with those offshore energy areas. For the y-axis, we combined a couple different metrics that quantify basically how easily a fishery might be affected by closure areas to calculate each fishing fleet's vulnerability. These 2 axes show the relative levels of risk across different ports and across different fisheries. And so in these examples, in these fisheries, you can see that the port of Coos Bay, these light blue squares in the DTS trawl and the non-DTS trawl fishery are relatively more at risk of being displaced from traditional fishing grounds than some of these other ports. While Brookings is most at risk for the midwater trawl fleet. But one of our big questions here is, will these relative measures of risk be the same in 20, 30, 50 years into the future? And so to get at that question, we used the model output from several species distribution models across the 4 DTS species that you see in panel A, 22 non-DTS groundfish species in panel B, and then 2 midwater rockfish species that you see in panel C. And so these maps show basically how the DTS species in panel A are projected to shift their density concentrations sort of offshore. So those are the areas in red where we have increased densities offshore. And the non-DTS species in panel B, their densities are projected to increase sort of at these intermediate depths and also into the northern areas of the Oregon coastline in the future. While the 2 midwater species in that panel C on the far right really show mostly decreasing levels of CPUE into the future across wide swaths of the US West Coast. And then you can also see examples of the fishing footprints that overlap with the offshore energy areas and that overlap with the projected increases and decreases inside those footprints and inside and outside of the offshore wind energy areas. So then we averaged the projected biomass values within those footprints that were either inside or outside the proposed offshore energy areas and plotted the time series from 2020 to 2100 that you see here. And really what I want you to sort of take home from this is that the non-DTS species are projected to increase in density inside the proposed areas of development. And this is particularly strongest for the ports of Brookings and Crescent City that you see inside the big red circle there on the screen. So Brookings and Crescent City non-DTS could potentially see some really different impacts in the future. So now if we go back to the risk assessment plot, we can see that the ports of Brookings, Oregon, and Crescent City, California, we're really sort of at the lower levels of risk compared to the other non-DTS fleets. So really, the question becomes, could this new information about potential lost opportunities for these fishing fleets in the future be considered in the planning process or used to inform various mitigation strategies? A second analysis that focuses on the albacore fishery is really just getting started, but early results suggest that albacore habitat is likely to shift inshore in warmer months of the year. And you can see sort of the really hot, warm colors along the coastline here in this panel on the far left in particular. You see those habitat conditions that are really good for albacore tuna to be shifting inshore. And so potentially that suggests an increase in overlap with many of these proposed offshore energy areas, and also could lead to increases in overlap between the commercial sector for albacore tuna and the recreational sector for albacore fishing. So lots of interesting things here to consider, and that work is still ongoing. Okay, finally, I'm going to speak to some of the main data gaps in assessing impacts to fisheries that we see at the moment. First is really that understanding changes to the underlying oceanographic conditions is one of the biggest gaps that we have related to impacts caused by offshore energy development. There's one study that has been done that has incorporated wind turbines in the Morro Bay wind energy area and the Humboldt wind energy, and visual modeling studies suggest that potential changes in wind speeds and upwelling as measured by this metric called QD, basically areas in purple in upwelling inshore and downstream of wind energy areas, particularly here in the area around the Morro Bay wind energy area. But what's really interesting is that these effects are spatially heterogeneous. You don't see quite the effect up in Northern California, where the Humboldt wind energy area is. So there's lots of unknowns here, and obviously there are no turbines in the water here off the west coast of the United States yet. So lots of needed scientific work to do related to removal of wind energy and the placement of these really large platforms and structures and new infrastructure in the water. We are developing ecosystem indicators that we hope can sort of serve as early warning indicators that can measure changes in some of these physical conditions. You can see in panel A, we have a spatial indicator for upwelling. And so thinking about some of these physical conditions and lower trophic level species that don't generally get into a suitability model or a trade-off analysis, we're really hoping that these types of early warning indicators can give us early warning of the downstream effects of these lower trophic level species. So that's ongoing. We also think that these types of indicators can help us help guide monitoring plans and survey designs for our scientific surveys. Understanding whether this new infrastructure is going to attract versus produce new fish, and how species, particularly forage and fishery species, are going to be attracted to the areas. How does that affect, where and how effective fisheries operate in and around these new areas of development? Also thinking about fisher behavior. Impacts to fisheries will come directly from being unable to operate in some traditional fishing grounds. So it's going to be important to identify where they redistribute their fishing effort, either in space or in different fisheries. And then how that subsequently affects their bottom lines. Does it change their fuel prices because they have to go around areas of development? How will it change their costs and revenue? And then the final sort of big gap that I'll leave you with today is thinking about our scientific surveys. Many of our surveys operate coastwide, and they will be impacted and not be able to operate within many of these areas of new development. So how will the loss of survey data affect stock assessment estimates and subsequently management advice? And so we're working on actually a couple of different research projects right now. And here we're sort of taking more of a cumulative effects approach. And by cumulative effects, I mean like multiple projects up and down the entire coast, and thinking about how the loss of data from areas that we know have been designated today versus areas that might be developed sometime in the future. So that work is ongoing. And then I will just end my talk today with a few take-home messages based on each of those sections. California current ecosystem, it's really driven by these physical processes that lead to seasonal upwelling that fuels productivity of lower trophic level components. I've shown you several spatial planning tools that we think can be effective in trying to identify, avoid, and minimize a lot of these potential interactions before those interactions even occur. We also think that including future scenarios in planning efforts could be really useful in revealing important considerations that we might miss if we just rely on historical information. And then finally, there are many different connections and interactions across the California current ecosystem sort of conceptual model that need to be studied more in order to understand those linkages and how they might impact fisheries. And I put a link here to our NIMS West Coast Strategic Science Plan for offshore energy. In that plan, we also identify several priority areas of research that we are hoping to address in the future. With that, I think I'll finish and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for the presentation. A lot of information there about the current ecosystem, our West Coast fisheries, and the great modeling work that has been done by both the Northwest and Southwest Fishery Science Centers. Thank you so much for that. I will see if there are any questions. We have, like I mentioned, we have folks here in the room that you may not be able to see very well, and folks online. So if you could please raise your hand. I have Steve Joner.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you for that. What's the status of the strategic science plan, and specifically the project George Waters was starting on the gliders? Can you tell us where that is now?
Well, the science plan is out there, and we are awaiting further guidance on efforts to work directly on that. George's project, I believe you're referring to gliders that will be doing surveys in and around the two wind energy areas off the coast of California. Those projects are dependent on staffing and funding levels that we don't quite know what they're going to be over the coming months and years. So I don't know the specific details of that at the moment, but we are waiting for further guidance.
Thanks, Kelly. We certainly appreciate the challenges that NOAA is facing and understand the difficulty in predicting what may happen in the near future. So thanks. I have Brian Penoyer.
Hey, good morning, and thanks again so much for speaking with us today. Really super helpful, particularly, well, everything you had to touch on was perfect. Just two quick questions I have, and really just asking you to maybe expand a little bit on. The first is you mentioned the model that the tool that BOEM used, which is the NOAA model. And you talked about the components. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you see the limitations of that model being in terms of what you think would be a more robust way to approach that. And then the second, with regard to the gaps, you mentioned a couple of sets of concerns about changing fisher behavior and survey behavior. And it struck me as I was listening to that, there's probably an unstated area. I wonder if you can expand on why that would be in these wind energy areas. Given, for example, just in my Coast Guard background, I know the Coast Guard's asked for a 1 mile track spacing between and that's mostly for helicopters. So I think this is all related to subsurface cables and that sort of thing. And I wonder if you could expand on whether you think there's a track spacing sort of mitigation that might allow some of these survey and fishery activities to be continued, partially continued, and so on.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, Brian. Let's see, thinking about your first question first, I think you were talking about limitations to the in-cost suitability model. There are pros and cons to each of those three analyses that I put forward. The suitability model uses dozens and dozens of spatial layers and uses various averaging functions to calculate those suitability indices. The way that the models have been run in the past is that those data layers can be given different weights. So if you think some endangered species spatial information is more important than a copepod spatial data layer, then that can be inputted. In the Oregon process, there were all data was considered equal, and so there are certainly ways that we can co-develop, the weightings of those different spatial layers according to what a set of stakeholders and managers think are the most important, and those can be scored and inputted into that process. So I think there's room for gathering that type of information and applying it to each of those spatial layers, and even just to understand the sensitivity of those weightings, and what is most important to the communities that are impacted and the offshore, and the energy development goals. So I think there's room for improvement there. On your fisher behavior question, certainly we don't know exactly, what the spacing and the cabling connections are going to look like in the water. And so, sort of our underlying guess is that most of these areas are not going to be operable. They're going to be off limits because we can't operate in these systems, for sure for, bought anything with a dragging a trawl through. There are spacing and maneuverability conditions that I'm sure you're more aware of than I am, that our scientific survey vessel captains have identified. And so, there are values, there are spacing values in which, potentially, if we knew where all the cabling was, that surveys could get in some places, that would be welcomed. For sure, in the Oregon process, we identified scientific surveys in the industry and operations submodel. And even after the draft wind energy areas were identified, we were allowed to comment and identified some areas of those wind energy areas that were important to our surveys, and they removed those areas based on that input. So there is opportunity to give that type of feedback during the process, and it's been successful in the past for limited applications, I guess. I hope that answered all your questions.
Thanks, Kelly. I have Mike Conroy and then Keith Michelle.
Hey, Kelly, it's good to see you. Thanks for presenting. Just a real quick question, piggybacking on the data gaps and uncertainties. There's a bullet that talks about fisheries behavior modeling. Does that limited to the harvester, or does that look at the community level impacts that may result from that change in fisheries behavior?
Depending on levels of funding, we hope to get to those community level types of impacts. The initial analyses are beginning with location choice models, so discrete choice modeling. That will be out in the water. That will result in changes in ex-vessel revenue, but I don't think we'll get to like expanding that to the communities. That would be hopefully a subsequent paper, an analysis, depending on future levels of funding.
Thanks.
And I should say those first analyses are focused on the groundfish bottom trawl community, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that for the other fisheries. And we have colleagues at the Southwest Center that have worked on coastal pelagic fishery choice modeling. So there is work out there as well.
Yeah, this is Keith Michelle. Thank you again, Kelly, for your presentation. A question on interactions. You separated it above water and below water, the absorbing of wind and the impact on upwelling, and then you talked about the foundations and mooring and their impact. In particular, it seems like a very challenging task to predict the impact of the foundations and the moorings on upwelling. How do you approach that? What's your level of confidence? What additional research is being done in that area?
Yeah. So our colleagues at the Southwest Center and through their contracting colleagues are currently updating their atmospheric and ocean models that will include wind turbines for the current wind energy areas off the coast of California, as well as some of these other proposed areas. And so they're updating those models. They're including current and potentially future areas of development in there to try to understand, how individual wind farms might affect upwelling and then multiple projects up and down the coast. Those models obviously have uncertainty associated with sort of every variable in every level of that model. The results that the one figure that I showed sort of at the end there relates to the metric known as CUTI. It's cumulative upwelling. I'm forgetting what the T stands for, but it's a cumulative upwelling index. So over the time of the entire year. And so seeing those cumulative levels reduced and the associated error associated with that is definitely a scientific venture that we're working on and in trying to improve those models. And then the grand idea is to determine whether those differences are different from just the background ocean and climate variability. And so really the test is, do those 2 to 5 to 8% changes in upwelling fall outside the bounds of normal historical variation for that metric, that CUTI metric. So thinking about that, I think is the main objective of their work right now, and that will continue to be improved. And then think about coupling that oceanographic or the atmospheric oceanographic model to a biogeochemical model, so that we can couple the loss of wind all the way through to the nutrients. That's going to be an important step. Do these upwelling changes have any effect on the biology of the system?
Thanks,
And
Kelly. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then, the platforms. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the scale of some of these platforms at least for the offshore wind energy turbines, but they're the size of soccer or your favorite football stadiums sized, but there's relatively that modeling work has not been done yet.
Thanks, Kelly. We have a question that was posed to us in the chat that was just relative to the suitability analyses, whether there were any sensitivity analysis to the cost components. So just from my knowledge, when we were looking at offshore wind development potentially off of Washington, we heard from developers that it would be like a minimum of 10 years before there would actually be any steel in the water, if you will. So the question is whether there had been any cost projections of how those might change, both for the actual engineering and getting the steel in the water, but then also the cost components of like fuel costs for fisheries, that kind of thing.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, if you're talking about the industry costs, and there's been lots of changes in those cost parameters from the development on the East Coast over the last several years. The data that was used in the Oregon suitability model was based on levelized cost, and there's several variables that go into that, and I'm not familiar with it, very much, but it's it has to do with the distance from shore and getting that energy to the market. But certainly those have changed if those analyses were done even 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. But I'm definitely not up to speed on the industry side of those costs.
Thanks. I have a question from Rebecca Lewison.
Hi, Kelly. How are you? Thanks so much. That was great. One question that's come up in the committee has been how much to use, even though we recognize that, of course, there's a lot of place-based consideration and analyses that offshore, particularly offshore wind, has been developed and in place in situ in other locations, even outside of the US. I don't know if you could talk about how much insights, general insights and findings, maybe on some of the physical processes or potential impacts, how that has, it could be from the East Coast, but even longer, they've had decades, like say in the North Sea, and how much you and your colleagues have used that information even to contextualize. So obviously we have a different coastline, but just on some of the maybe biophysical processes, how much that's influenced or been considered, or
Yeah. Yes. Thanks for the question, Rebecca. It's definitely hard. The North Sea is certainly, has the longest history for offshore wind. It's the infrastructure is really different. They use all fixed platforms that are, pile drived into the seabed, and whereas everything on the west coast is going to be floating, so you don't necessarily have those pilings in the water. But what they've found in the North Sea certainly is related to changes in turbulence and the structure, the mixed layer depth, where that occurs and how that gets altered, turbulence downstream and sedimentation, downstream. So that's going to be similar for many of the areas on the East Coast as well. So they're more able to take advantage of that history to, think about particularly the physics and of the system. It's the California current ecosystem as an upwelling driven system and really deep waters makes it really different. And so we're not going to see, the turbulence types of impacts that they see with the fixed foundations, but with the extremely large platforms, we just don't know. You can, in our strategic science plan, we talk about needing to understand how these platforms and associated cabling and mooring lines will attract different species. Are they going to attract, small forage fishes that then attract larger, highly migratory species or other larger coastal pelagics? And will that sort of attraction versus production question, scientifically, could this be a form to try to answer those attraction versus production questions is really interesting, but we just don't know. Let's see, I had one other thought and now I've lost it. Yeah, well, I think the answer is we don't have the comparable history in the North Sea for sure. There are small scale floating wind farms off the coast of Portugal and Scotland that are coming online. They're relatively small at the moment, but by the time we're getting closer to development on the West Coast, perhaps there'll be information that we can use from those sightings. But to date, our modeling is mostly focused on extraction of winds, and then definitely need to get to the effects on currents and small scale surface disruptions, especially when we think about larval delivery and whether that gets altered. How does that affect, entrainment, or not entrainment, but the movement of larvae inshore, offshore, and up and down the coast? So that's a big data gap that needs to be worked on.
Got it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. We are just a little bit over time, so really appreciate you spending the time with us this morning. And we have some additional questions. We may follow up with you by email if that's okay.
Yes, please do.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we will have a presentation on tribal treaty fishing rights. And I will ask Diana Bob to please introduce our next speaker.
Great. Hi, is Monty on the line? Okay. Hi, Monty. This is Diana, ominous voice. Can't see you, but I've been told you're there. So just a brief introduction. Monty is a professor of law at the University of Washington Law School. There you are. And he teaches American Indian law, property law, and I think other duties as assigned by the law school faculty and management. Monty joined the UW Law School in 2022. Prior to that, he was at the University of Montana, and he is, I think, a rare specimen in the legal academia world where he was a real lawyer for a bit of time. I've had the opportunity to present on panels with Monty in the past and been to many of the continuing legal education things that he organizes there at University of Washington, and did recommend that he give have an opportunity to share with the committee kind of like Indian Treaty Rights 101, as that is one of our task orders to address in our work in this committee. All the details about Monty's legal pedigree is in his written assignments and things, but I think that's a good enough intro. So, works for everyone? Great.
Thanks, Diana. And hello, everybody. Good to see you or join you virtually. Appreciate the opportunity. As was mentioned, I'm going to go through a brief presentation and maybe more brief, recognizing I'm the last thing standing between you and lunch. But then want to be sure we have opportunity for question and discussion. Also appreciate folks submitting questions early, and Madeline sent me some of those questions. So I'll try to tick off some of those as we go through. But please do feel free as I present. You can drop questions in the chat. I have that open. I'm happy to see those, but then we should have time to discuss afterwards. So I'm going to share some slides and then we'll go from there. I do want to say, as Diana mentioned, this is 20 minutes or so on an area of law that spans back well even before the founding of the United States, and I think from a tribal perspective goes back to time immemorial. So recognizing that, this is certainly a very sort of high level presentation, and I understand there's likely a variety of familiarity and sort of connection with these issues in the room. So sensitive to that, but happy to go as deep as folks would like, especially as we move forward. And then afterward, happy to be a resource. I will also say there were some of the questions that came up beforehand, and maybe some of the questions on your mind are really seeking answers or guidance around sort of the views of particular tribes or sort of values that certain tribes may attach to some of these resources. And I want to be clear, at least from my perspective, as Diana mentioned, I come from a law and policy background. I'm not native myself, but I've worked on behalf of tribal governments for basically my whole career as a lawyer. So I just want to be clear that my intent is not to speak on behalf of or in place of tribes themselves and tribal individuals as well. And I think that might be a theme also to keep in mind throughout this discussion is part of this issue, it seems to me, is about engagement and understanding of tribal perspectives and views on resources or impacts to those resources that may be possible. So with those caveats, I'm going to dive in. So I wanted to start just with this map. This is a map, hopefully maybe most of you have seen this before, but it's an attempt by some folks to try and capture the diversity and ubiquity of indigenous cultures and presence across the continent of North America prior to the arrival of folks from elsewhere. And I wanted to start here for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's an important starting point, obviously historically accurate in terms of connections to these resources since time immemorial. It's also legally relevant in the context of both treaty issues and the rights reserved in those treaties, which in many instances seek to preserve connections to these original connections that indigenous peoples maintain with these resources. And we'll talk a little bit about the ways in which the law, particularly federal law that's grown up around treaty rights, seek to insulate and protect those connections to these resources. So it's important from those perspectives. But I also want to point out some shortcomings of this map, which are especially relevant, I think, to this discussion, which is that you'll note that these, for many of these groups, at least as depicted on this map, their interest stops at the shoreline. And I don't know that that is accurate. It's certainly not accurate in terms of connections that many indigenous folks had and continue to maintain with regard to offshore resources. But it reflects, I think, perhaps narrow and maybe limited view of the ways in which reserved rights, whether treaty reserved or continually exercised, do extend well beyond the sort of terrestrial landscape. And it's reflected a little bit in the case law around treaty rights and offshore resources, but for many of the same reasons we'll talk about with regard to the foundations of treaty rights under federal law, we can think and hopefully will think more broadly about the connections that indigenous folks had and continue to maintain both onshore and offshore with regard to these resources. So with that as a starting point, I want to talk more specifically about treaties. And as I mentioned, the practice of treaty making as a interaction, as a legal tool, as a formal representation of a coming together of governments is a tool or a resource that was brought to the quote unquote New World by folks from elsewhere. But it wasn't a mistake and it wasn't an accident that treaties became the method of interaction between European colonizing forces and indigenous nations. And that's because the use of treaties was recognized around the world by European countries and others as a tool of international law and an important legal recognition of sovereign to sovereign relationships and agreements. And so it was even well before the founding of the United States, the mechanism by which nations interacted with each other. And upon arriving here and finding many diverse and numerous nations, that is the legal mechanism that European nations often utilize to formalize their relations with indigenous nations. Now, those also played a particular role in the founding of the United States. Of course, as folks hopefully may recognize, the Constitution does recognize the presence of Indian tribes well before the founding of the United States, only mentioning tribes once in the Commerce Clause in the context of foreign nations and among the several states. But the Constitution also specifically recognizes the making of treaties in the Supremacy Clause and seeks to ensure that the treaties both made before the Constitution and those made after would be upheld and protected as a constitutional matter as the supreme law of the land. And that helps ensure that those relations, those government to government bonds, especially with tribal nations, are properly protected in the context of the constitutional structure. And from the earliest days of the United States Supreme Court, this is Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the sort of godfathers of the court as we know it. The court had recognized that the actions of the United States had long sort of committed itself, at least as a legal matter. And certainly there's a longer and darker and deeper history of the breach of those treaty promises or the failure to honor those treaty promises by the United States. But as a commitment on the part of the United States, the Supreme Court long recognized that Congress had sought to ensure the protection of those treaty promises, consistent with their constitutional status as the supreme law of the land. So I talk about that just as a way to really, hopefully, for folks who may not be familiar or as familiar with the use of treaties and that treaty relationship, that this really is not just an issue of tribal interest, but is in some ways, in many ways, foundational to the sort of constitutional structure. And through the Supremacy Clause, treaties, and particularly treaties with tribes, but treaties elsewhere, provide an important link to ensure that continuing government to government relationship between the United States and tribal nations isn't interfered with by actions of, say, state governments or others who may have other interests that might conflict with either treaty reserved rights or the promises that were made by the United States. Now, I want to just pause here for a second, and we'll talk a little bit toward the end about, there was a question that came up about, well, what about tribes that don't have treaties, and what about those rights? And I'll say we'll talk a little bit about the ways in which the law around treaty rights has evolved that provides a broader basis for thinking about reserved rights. But I do think that sort of government to government relationship, it grew out of interpretation of the treaty promises made by the United States, but it has evolved to really encompass all, at least on the part of the United States, all federally recognized tribes, to ensure that they enjoy the same relationship, the same trust responsibility that the United States owes to tribes is shared across all tribes, whether they are a so-called treaty tribe or not. The United States doesn't treat tribes differently in terms of their obligation, their trust duties, and their recognition of their status as a sovereign and their continuing rights and interests as a tribal government. So there are some important distinctions. And in fact, I would say among each tribe, even similarly situated or seemingly similarly situated treaty tribes, the history of each tribe, their own interest and connection, maybe their understanding of a particular treaty term or otherwise is, and may be quite different. And that's one, I think, important takeaway here too, is that not just sort of distinguishing between treaty tribes and non-treaty tribes, but really understanding each individual tribal group, each tribal government, and even within a tribal community, different tribal members may have their own perspectives, their own rights and status, given the history and treaty language and connection to some of these resources. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit more on sort of treaty making and the law, especially here in Washington. I'll just use this as one example. Of course, treaties were used, especially at the insistence of the United States, to serve broader national interests, opening up territory, isolating tribes to particular reservations, and seeking the cession of large tracts of land from tribes as a bargain for exchange, or at least in theory, a bargain for exchange on the part of the United States. And you can see this is just one representation of how that process worked across the country. As a matter of sort of United States policy, treaty making continued as a formal legal matter up until 1871. At that point, Congress passed a rider and an appropriation bill saying, we're not going to make formal treaties anymore. But the United States continued to essentially do the same thing through a variety of statutes, through executive orders, really trying to carry out those same purposes for the same reasons. They just weren't technically formally treaties. And even in those later agreements and those sort of executive orders, the same principles of interpretation that we'll talk about that have developed in the context of treaties also apply, given the United States obligations and interests and relationship with tribes. And you can see, as folks I'm sure are aware, generally, and treaty by treaty, tribe by tribe, this varies and may be different, but the terms of the treaty really defined the nature of those transactions as the tribes would have understood them. In many instances, tribes insisting on, as part of those bargains, the reservation of continuing rights to access resources, to continue lifeways that they'd enjoyed since time immemorial, such as hunting, fishing, gathering, etc. Now, that, of course, isn't the end of the story, because as a legal matter, and certainly as changes happened across westward expansion in the history of the country, the interpretation and application of the principles of treaties evolved. And particularly across the series of cases in the 20th century, those principles became at least a little bit more certain. And starting the 20th century really with the sort of first case to address these issues in the early 1900s was perhaps a marker of the times that the United States Supreme Court determined in the context of a treaty related to some tribes in the south central part of the country. The question was really, what was the strength of treaties when it came to the interests of the United States? And in that case, a case called Lone Wolf, the court upheld the right of the United States, the power of the United States through Congress to unilaterally abrogate treaties. Now, although that power was recognized, it was done sort of in the context of the era, the allotment and assimilation era. And even there, the court made it clear that Congress had to act sort of clearly. They had this power, they could do this, but they had to act in an express way in order to exercise that power to abrogate treaty promises that had been made. And so that sort of indicated at the dawn of the 20th century, and particularly in the depths of the allotment and assimilation era, that perhaps the court was looking more at kind of modern considerations or the interests of the United States, and maybe not so much at the status of treaties and the constitutional nature of those treaties. But importantly, it was just a couple years later when a case arising out here in the Pacific Northwest that was specifically about fishing rights came back before the court and really sort of set the stage for the modern era ever since the over century, now and almost a quarter of jurisprudence around treaty rights. And folks may be familiar with this language. This is language that was at issue in this case, the Winans case from the treaty with the Yakima. It's also consistent with a number of the so-called Stevens treaties, or the treaties with tribes here in the Northwest, in which those tribes reserved particular rights, and as set forth here, the rights to take fish at all usual and accustomed places in common with the citizens of the territory. Now, the issue in Winans was that the state of Washington, which had recently joined the Union, had authorized the Winans brothers to build a fish wheel in a place that was a usual and accustomed place enjoyed by the Yakima members to fish along the Columbia since time immemorial. And the challenge that came out of that, brought by the United States on behalf of the Yakima, was whether or not, number one, that treaty right still existed, whether it survived the test of time, and especially in the context of Washington's rights as a state. Did, for example, Washington entering the Union as a state necessarily mean that those treaty rights ended, because it sort of limited Washington's ability, say, to give the Winans brothers the rights to this particular property? And in light of what the Supreme Court had just held a few years earlier in Lone Wolf, you might think that the court would say, oh, no, those are old promises that don't matter anymore in this sort of modern era, the 20th century. But they went a different direction. And the way that the court approached this issue in Winans is really important in terms of the foundations of treaty rights jurisprudence, and really the structure of how treaties have been interpreted ever since. And it drew on some earlier cases, but it really brought those principles into the 20th century. And importantly here, the recognition that treaties, the sort of context in which these treaties were made, was relevant to how the court should interpret that language. It wasn't just the language on the treaty document itself, that was important, but it was also what the tribes would have understood by that promise, and the context in which that promise was made. Specifically, for example, the fact that prior to the treaty, the Yakima, for all intents and purposes, sort of had the run of the place. They could hunt, they could fish, they could use the resource as they saw fit. And that in entering this treaty with the United States, they didn't give up all of that. In fact, they were reserving these rights to continue that. And that notion that treaties are really a reservation of rights by the tribe and a granting of rights to the United States instead of the other way around was really a foundational principle by which treaties should be judged going forward. And as I said, in some ways back to those early Supreme Court cases. It also recognized that, unlike maybe the state of Washington would have argued, the treaties promise more to the tribes than just sort of the rights that every other citizen would have. The court said that would be a pretty impotent outcome to this important government to government sort of sovereign relationship if all the tribe got out of this treaty was just to be on the same basis as every other citizen in the state of Washington. So the court recognized these treaty rights almost like a property right, like an easement to continue to access these places and to continue to exercise these activities. And that was within the scope of many more rights that, if the treaty was silent about, the tribe did not give up, retained those reserved rights, consistent with that idea that the tribe retained or was giving up rights to the United States, not getting all these rights from the United States. And then with regard to the state's arguments, the court essentially said, look, Washington became a state well after the United States had ensured these promises to the Yakama Nation. Those rights would continue. Washington sort of came to that bargain and took its powers subject to those treaty reserved rights. Of course, the court then said, but Washington may be able to regulate those to some degree, and we'll talk about the ways that some of the subsequent litigation over that point has evolved. So there really are some important canons, some important rules for treaty construction that came out of the Winans case and have really begun or really provided the ways in which courts ever since have looked at treaties. And these canons of construction are fundamental to ensuring the treaty reserved promises maintain their sort of constitutional structure and preserve those sovereign to sovereign bonds. Now, I'll also say, because of the nature of enactments on the part of the United States after formal treaty making ended, or statutes that affect tribal interests, these rules of interpretation have been applied beyond just treaty promises to look at statutes, to look at executive orders, to ensure that the rights of tribes are protected, and these statutes and other legal enactments are liberally interpreted to ensure tribal rights are honored and protected. So these canons really seek to provide that for treaties, but they've also been applied in the context of statutes as well. Now, importantly, interpreting the treaties as the tribes would have understood them, and that goes to, for example, challenges or questions about where a usual and accustomed place of fishing might be. Generally, when those challenges or those issues have come up, tribes have sought to look back and try to understand, well, what were the tribe's practices? What would the tribe have understood at the time the treaty was made about where those usual and accustomed places are? And if there's ambiguities in sort of what that means, then those are to be liberally interpreted in the tribe's favor. And the sort of broad construction of the treaty is to be liberally done in the tribe's favor as well. And as I mentioned, that sort of first canon, the reserved rights notion, really seeks to ensure that tribes, unless they've given those rights up to the United States, those rights remain reserved in the face of silence, for example, in a treaty. Now, there's been a whole series of cases up here in Washington in particular. Folks, I'm sure, are familiar with the Bolt decision about the allocation of the salmon fishery. Ultimately sort of continuing conflicts over those going back up to the Supreme Court in the commercial passenger fishing vessel case in 1979. Other issues arising in the context of that litigation about the rights of tribes to harvest shellfish, even despite or in the face of claims from private property owners or state authorities with regard to tidelands, and the same principles of treaty interpretation being used by the court to ensure the protection of those tribal rights. And then even more broadly, the United States Supreme Court in cases about hunting and fishing elsewhere really brought those same principles all the way forward into the sort of 21st century, most expansively, I think, in this Mille Lacs case from 1999, where the court went back to that same Winans framework and the canons of construction to confirm that those treaties still exist, notwithstanding objections from states. Now, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the Culverts case, which folks may be familiar with. This is some language from that decision. But in this case, the question was whether or not those same or similar treaty language about the right to take fish meant that the United States and tribes could enjoin the state of Washington from, or basically force the state to fix culverts that were blocking the passage of fish. And it was really about whether a treaty term like the right to take fish implied additional protections for habitat or other sort of steps that had to be taken to ensure the salmon could continue to migrate and be accessed by the tribes. And here the court, the Ninth Circuit, in this language, I think makes clear that it is this sort of the nature of the promise, the context in which that promise was made, the implied rights that come along with these treaty principles that, in the court's view at least, required the state of Washington to hurry up and to actually be enjoined to fix these barrier culverts in order to ensure fish passage. To not do so was a violation of the treaty, even though the treaty language itself didn't say anything about those duties or the sort of blockage of fish passage, anything like that. And that principle, I think, is important because it highlights that there are sort of implied promises, and it's not just the language of the treaty. In other cases, I'm not going to talk about just in the interest of time, the court, for example, has looked at language in the creation of reservations, even outside the context of treaties, that doesn't say anything, for example, about rights to water, but interpreted that language to ensure that the creation of the reservation also implied rights to water sufficient to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. And that same principle has been used in the context of fisheries, for example, in Northern California, Southern Oregon, to ensure that those continuing rights are protected, even though someone who's not familiar with the history or might just look at the face of executive order establishing a reservation wouldn't see those rights being implicated. Just to highlight a few more recent cases, the modern Supreme Court, and particularly I think with Justice Gorsuch, has addressed these treaty principles in a number of cases. So this isn't just sort of an artifact of history, but these cases continue to arise. And most famously, I would say in 2020, the court really relied on those same treaty principles to ensure that the treaty reservations, treaty reserved areas in Oklahoma remain intact for tribes there. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to take more questions. The remaining slides in my presentation just sort of point to some other resources that provide some general information, a restatement of law of American Indians, which repeats some of these foundational principles. So encourage folks to check those out if you're interested. And I'm also more than available to answer questions down the road if folks have those as well. And my contact information is in the slides, but I'll stop there and then happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Monty, for your presentation. There's a lot of information there, a lot of great information for us to absorb. We'll look around the room and to folks online to see if there are questions. Jeremy?
Yeah, hi, Monty, Jeremy Firestone. Really great presentation. I think it was a really terrific overview for the committee. So we've got this body of Indian law. We've got the culverts case. We know that as well, Indian fishing rights have been affected by large hydroelectric dams on the Columbia and other Northwest river systems. How do we think about, and we know that, although you didn't discuss it, that there are established rights to fish in the ocean for treaty tribes, for some treaty tribes. How do we think about the potential, I guess, first, the obstruction impacts of putting turbines in the offshore environment for treaty rights, and as well any ecological changes that might occur? We just had a presentation on upwelling and how that might affect fisheries. How do we think about that in this sort of broad legal context?
Yeah, and I think that's the true rub, right? And it's been a challenge, I think, in many different contexts to consider the ways in which various projects or interests might intersect with either treaty reserved rights or just sort of tribal interest or reserved rights more broadly. I would say a couple of things. One, I think these foundational principles are important to recognize that, first and foremost, there may well be these rights that are implicated, even if they sort of haven't been considered in the context of other developments that have happened, like, for example, hydroelectric power or other projects that have affected them historically. And that it's both the sort of right itself and the corresponding engagement, connection, assertion of sort of tribal sovereign priorities that may be worthwhile in mentioning. And I think that's been the basis for the growing standards for engagement, for example, through government to government consultation and the involvement of tribal governments in sort of commenting on, well, we do have rights here, we have interests here, and here's how we see these proposals intersecting with or affecting our rights or our interests in these particular areas. And I think that also then can serve to inform not just sort of how a proposal might affect a tribal interest, although I think the tribe is generally the best source of information about how that happens, but then also the ways in which sort of those bigger questions might be thought of as well. For example, tribes expanding their role in sort of management and oversight of various resources, whether rooted in treaty principles or sort of more broadly connections and understanding of those resources, can then sort of be a more proactive way to address and consider some of those hard questions. I don't think there's any silver bullet answer for how that happens, other than sort of the continual work and recognition of the tribal presence and interest and potentially treaty reserved or other legal rights that may be implicated. And I think that really suggests, if not requires, a thoughtful way to continue engagement and sort of tribal participation in those considerations.
And just to sort of a follow-up, so you also talked about McGirt, and then we were embarking, assuming we don't stop, on sort of a new experiment with Bears Ears and co-management. And so how do principles of co-management relate to the oceans and into the fishery?
Yeah, well, those principles, I think, are reflected a little bit in my prior answer, but I think that the same principles apply whether on land or in fishery resources, wildlife resources, or in the coastal environment. I mean, the movement around co-management at Bears Ears, for example, really came from tribal leaders, tribal voices, tribal advocates saying, look, we have important interests and connections in these regions, and therefore we think the United States should take certain actions with regard to their management and protection. And we want to be a part of that. We want to collaborate and be a meaningful partner in the ways in which that happens. Now, importantly, as it relates to Bears Ears, and this is true, I think, in some places where offshore interests may be implicated, those tribes generally weren't relying on treaty reserved rights in those areas, but rather sort of their longstanding connections, as well as the broader sort of federal government trust responsibility and sort of duty to ensure and work with tribes on a government to government basis. And that's really where I think it's not just about sort of consultation and engagement and ensuring that decisions made without tribal input either don't affect or sort of are mitigated in the context of tribal interests. But what co-management and sort of those broader collaborative partnerships are really about is really providing a basis on which there's meaningful opportunities for tribes, not just to sort of participate and comment, but really to help shape the proposal, which has the benefit, I think, of mitigating and identifying and addressing all of those interests, but also generally, as I think we're likely to see at Bears Ears and have already sort of seen in the context of the proposed management plan there, is going to result in better management decisions going forward anyway, because in general, and recognizing what I said earlier about the challenges of generalizing, but in general, right, tribes and the folks who are engaged in these resources and most connected to them, they're relying on millennia of information and tradition about how those resources function, how they work, and that I think can tend to lead to better inputs in terms of management decisions going forward. So I think co-management isn't limited in that way, and there are many, many legal bases on which those processes can be expanded and built on going forward. I think we're just sort of seeing the beginning of that movement at Bears Ears and elsewhere.
Thank you, Monty. I have a few questions here in the room. I have Brian Penoyer followed by Keith Mitchell. Keith Michelle.
Hey, Monty, thanks again for your presentation. It's really excellent. I guess I would invite you to maybe expand a little bit on how you see the interaction of just broadly treaty rights with other national frameworks. And I think this is kind of a weighting question, right? Which is to say, as an example, the Coast Guard did its port access route study. That was based on legislation that said navigation is the nation's primary interest, right? And by the way, we'll consult with the tribes, and by the way, we'll do NEPA processing and so on. But at least in my experience, is the weighting of the interests of these different parts of the society is not really well spelled out. And I wonder if you have thoughts that you can offer us on those interactions and how we should think about tribal rights in terms of weighting and prioritization. For instance, is a minor impact to tribal rights supersede a moderate, larger societal gain? And how would we think about that?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about that. One is, I think looking backward, the balance of those interests has historically either not weighted or considered those tribal interests, and that's led to a number of challenges. And in many ways, a lot of the litigation around treaty reserved rights is the result of that failure to really consider and balance the potential interests appropriately. And so I think there is some risk, especially when we're talking about treaty reserved rights under the Constitution, that imbalance or failure to consider those rights or impacts on those rights that are significant, just like the culverts, right, presents some legal basis on which those can be challenged. I would say I mean, this is an ongoing and sort of fundamental issue, is sort of where do these rights fit in with whether it's multiple use on public lands or other statutory charges, like how do those trying to balance all of these interests account for and really fit these rights in? And that's part of the reason why I think it's important to recognize sort of the status and foundations of especially treaty reserved rights, but I think more broadly, the sort of sovereign to sovereign relationship of tribes. And that sort of sovereign status, I think, separates at least interactions with tribal governments from maybe other stakeholders or interested parties who may have those opportunities for input. And in the context, I think, of sort of statutory charges or obligations, there's long been sort of a consideration that when it comes to tribal relations and the duty to consult or those types of things, like that's sort of isolated within Indian affairs, and they're the ones responsible for that, rather than sort of a broader government-wide sort of United States obligation. And I think if you think about that in the context of like how might the interests of state governments be considered in those same frameworks, or how might the interests of like foreign nations in terms of their obligations or the obligations of decision-making processes to keep those interests in check, that might help sort of work through some of those things. But I would also say that the ultimate sort of consideration on sort of balancing really, to me at least, requires or would benefit from the consideration and assessment of tribal governments themselves, because what may seem like a minor impact from a sort of weighing of other perspectives is likely going to be something assessed very differently from a tribal perspective. And I think to the extent that can be meaningfully incorporated into the process, that's going to provide a little bit different metric for considering how those interests get balanced.
Yeah, thank you, Mani, for your presentation. In one of your slides, one of the more recent decisions, the court used the term that the fishing in reserved areas needs to be provided at a level that will sustain moderate living. That's a very interesting phrase. And what did they mean by that, and how has that been interpreted? Because that seems to take into account the secondary effects. You know, if you change the ecology in one place and it influences the fishing in their reserved area, you know, but how is the interpretation? I know it's recent, but how has it been interpreted?
Yeah, that's been a topic of a lot of judicial discussion and argument in these cases. It was a standard that kind of came out of some of the earlier litigation about the allocation of the fisheries. And it's been disagreed over in terms of whether does that serve as a limit? Is that sort of a cap? How does that fit with the sort of essence of the treaty reserved right? In the context, for example, of the Culver's case, the way the court looked at that, and in some ways, the moderate living standard has been used by folks suggesting that there is no longer a treaty reserved right, say, to a particular number of fish, especially where, for example, tribal members could access other resources that would still guarantee a moderate living. Folks sort of on the other side of tribal treaty rights claims have said, well, look, this moderate living standard really means like they don't have to have salmon in the streams if they can sort of access other resources that would provide a moderate living. And I think at least what the Ninth Circuit said in the Culverts case was to kind of reject that limited view, or the ways in which the moderate living standard might be read as a limit, and rather to say, look, the language of the treaty says the right to take fish. The tribes understood that was a guarantee that they would have continuing access to fish, not limited by some sort of trade-off or some other way to access resources. So I think the context of that language and the moderate living sort of denomination that really sort of courts have read into the allocation question has been a topic of continuing discussion, but at least most recently in the Culverts litigation, the court really returned to those principles to say, well, is that really what the tribes would have understood by the treaty promise? Not really, at least not that interpretation. But as you know, it is a term and a phrase that has come into this litigation and has been the topic of a lot of discussion and controversy.
Thanks. I have Dave Checkley, followed by Mike Conroy, and then Steve Joner. Oh, sorry, Dave Checkley, followed by Steve Joner.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. My question bears upon location, and by definition, offshore renewable energy is offshore. And most of and I'm unfamiliar with usual and accustomed. And so it seems like most usual and accustomed information, if you will, is derived from land-based cases or near-shore cases and I'm curious if you see a qualitative difference between the focus on the offshore areas and the lack of such litigation or discovery or whatever it would be that is form the basis for usual and accustomed in cases on land. Maybe it's a ridiculous question. I have no idea, but
no.
Enjoy your comments on it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it goes to sort of the point I started with the map, which is that, for, I think, a variety of reasons, the nature and sort of history of treaty litigation has been focused on some of these areas as opposed to really thought about or applied in particularly far shore sort of marine environment outside the near shore context. Now, there are obviously exceptions to that, and I think in particular folks may be example from or familiar with, for example, the macaw whaling issues and the treaty reserved rights there and the ways in which those have been interpreted. And I mean, from a legal perspective, from a doctrinal perspective, there really is no distinction, right, in terms of the treaty reserved rights to take fish at usual and accustomed places, if there is a basis on which that right reserved that language reserved the right to access and exercise those rights near shore, on land, far shore. I mean, the principles applicable to treaty interpretation would require what was the tribe's understanding of that treaty language, of that reserved right at the time the treaty was made? Are there ambiguities in the way that has been used? And I think the framework for interpreting and applying that wouldn't really make a distinction between the particular location, but it would instead look at sort of the context and history and tribal understanding and apply those canons to really understand it. Now, as I said, I think for a variety of reasons, that historical or otherwise, there hasn't been a lot of development of those same principles in other environments in the same way, like, in the Columbia Basin and the US v. Washington litigation, a lot of those things have been sorted out. And in particular, in recent years, sort of conflicts over which usual and accustomed places go where have been extensively litigated. But from a doctrinal principle, I don't think there's a distinction really to be made, provided there is evidence that, would support an application of those treaty principles about a particular location. Yeah, and Brian asked in the chat about the international law and sort of law of the sea principles. I mean, I think that introduces further complexities into some of these analyses as well. And I think in nearshore, it raises a lot of the same sort of federalism, reserved rights, submerged land principles. Farther out, I think that's part of the reason why there's been more complexity on some of those considerations as well. I will also say, like, you can think about Native Hawaiian communities, right, or other indigenous communities that are subject to other legal frameworks that introduce even further complexity into some of these issues as well.
Hi, Monty. Steve Joner with the Makah tribe. I guess I have a kind of a philosophical question for you.
Sure.
My experience going back to shortly after Bolt and representing the Makah tribe, the federal agencies, for the most part, don't understand what you just explained. And it takes many, many years for an agency, for the individuals within that agency who are working with the tribes to really grasp that and understand it. And so to me, it's a question of corporate culture. You know, does the agency have a corporate culture where they fully understand and are then able to fulfill their obligation to the tribes? And so the example I could give is National Marine Fisheries Service was not very supportive of the Makah tribe in trying to reestablish its halibut fisheries and throughout that litigation. But fortunately, you know, the people we work with now at NOAA Fisheries, they do get it. And I often give the example of NOAA Fisheries as an agency that really does understand how to work with the tribes. And they do view the tribes as equals, as partners. So when BOEM showed up, there was a lot of frustration dealing with them because, okay, here's a whole new crop of uneducated bureaucrats coming in here. And there was a lot of frustration up and down the coast by the tribes working with BOEM because they just don't get it. So how can that be addressed on a national scale? And again, I know it takes years working directly with personnel within an agency for them to really understand it and to make that commitment. So how do we do it with a brand new agency?
Yeah. I don't know that there's a good silver bullet answer to that one either. I would say everybody's got to come to my class in law school and take American Indian law for a quarter, and that might help. And you're welcome anytime. So send all your federal agency friends over whenever you get a chance. But I do think, like, what you just highlighted, right? Particularly the time and the challenge of really building relationships that meaningfully provide a basis on which progress can be made. I mean, I think that really gets to it, right? Because so often the relationship around many of these issues is sort of transactional or project based. And in a lot of ways, I think, at least from my perspective, that's reflective of sort of agency culture in many places. Like, we have this proposal, we have this report, we have this study, we need to get this done. Here's the priority, whether set by Congress or others. And the way in which tribes have been considered, if at all, in those structures is like, oh, and we have to consult with tribes, right? And like, we got to go check this box over here to make sure we can keep going here. And back to the question about sort of co-management and engagement, I think starting from a whole different perspective that tribes really are partners here, not just in the context of like providing input and insight into their interests, but more broadly in how all of these agencies, whether BOEM or anybody else, can better meet their obligations. That might provide a different sort of starting point for those agencies in terms of approaching that work, as opposed to like, oh, we have this, and then tribes are sort of over here, and we just do that as we can. But really, this is our mission. I mean, I think what this history of federal Indian law and the broader sort of federal trust responsibility would suggest is, no, like the mission is including tribal interests in a meaningful way. That's what the principles of treaty interpretation would say from the beginning, and the broader trust duty as well. Now, in terms of education and sort of outreach and ways to help recenter that, I mean, I think that number one depends on the agency, right? Depends on leadership, and really requires a sustained commitment to ensuring, or at least providing, a basis on which people can begin to think about this, not as like an extra step or some sort of adjacent superfluous obligation, or even sort of contrary to what their mission is, but ways in which it is part of the mission and can really not just like be a way to avoid challenges, but actually enhance and improve the ability of the agency to do what Congress or others have charged it to do. But I think that's a long-term project, and one that takes, for the reasons you mentioned, really sustained commitment on the part of leadership, and ensuring it is a strategy moving forward. And I think it's happening. Like I think that is happening, right? And I think co-management, co-stewardship, the development of these different frameworks for understanding the mission, like it's happening, but certainly it takes a lot more work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monty. We're going to go with one last question here. I have Jeremy.
Thanks. So trying to think about this more broadly, and thinking about the culverts case, and thinking about offshore wind energy's potential to displace other kinds of generation, and setting aside the climate issues. But we know there are large impacts of fishery on hydropower, and we know there are large impacts from any kind of thermal plant on larvae and et cetera. How do we think about this issue broadly in the context of Indian fishing rights?
I try never to say this because it is so cliche for a lawyer and law professor to give this answer, but I would say it depends. Particularly in the context of sort of the scope of those trade-offs, right? But also I would say, from a tribal fishing rights perspective, I mean, there may be interests in particular areas that would suggest there should be, and I think we've seen some of these challenges and positions be expressed already, there should be no offshore wind here, given its impacts on these resources and concerns that, some of the same patterns of decision making that have marginalized or excluded those interests are being repeated just in an offshore context. There may be other situations where, for precisely the reasons you were saying, tribal interests may be aligned with, like, yeah, if this can be a way in which we can mitigate some of these other historical impacts of energy generation, we're all for it, right? Provided it's done in these particular ways. So I'm not sure there's a global theory or answer to how to sort of weigh those, but I do think you're hitting on exactly sort of the historical legacy and challenge of some of the ways in which these decisions have been made, and really thinking about that in the context of wind energy or sort of offshore development going forward, hopefully will ensure a different approach to some of the tribal interests and concerns, which, at least as a historical matter, has sort of been sidelined in terms of how those decisions get made.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Monty, for taking the time and patiently answering our questions. We really appreciate it.
Of
Thank
course, like I said, happy to follow up if folks have questions. My contact info is on the last slide, but you can also find me on the UW School of Law website, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, thank you, everybody. That concludes our morning session of the open meeting. Our committee is going to take a lunch break, and we'll be back online at 1:30 Eastern or 1:30 Pacific time. Have to remember where I am.
Got it. Yeah, we'll begin with a major item in our task was looking at risk reduction and mitigation of adverse impacts for safety at sea and search and rescue of CG operations. So we have two speakers well experienced both on the surf side and the air, and they'll be introduced by Brian.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Penoyer, and I retired from the Coast Guard about a year ago. I had the great good fortune to meet both of these gentlemen, although I suspect they don't remember me. Chief Warrant Officer Dan Shipman is currently working with the Coast Guard as a civil servant, but he comes with 23 years of experience, and he is by training and avocation a surfman, which in the Coast Guard is a really specialized community of folks who work in the extraordinary heavy weather, primarily in the Pacific Northwest. Dan retired from active duty as a surfman when his knees gave out, I think he'll say, 2000. But let me just give you a quick rundown of his background. He was a surfman at stations Coos Bay, Depot Bay, Chetco River, seasonal detachments for search and rescue out of Cold Beach and Brandon, Oregon. But he was the officer in charge of Quiet River and Tillamook Bay. He had a lot of other jobs near and dear to my heart as a guy who cared a lot about oil spill response and other things. But I think what I would tell you is that there is nobody better to tell us about the day-to-day search and rescue work of the Pacific Northwest, and particularly that which requires the very specialized skills and vessels for surf rescue than Dan Shipman. He comes with the added side benefit of really being able to comment on recreational boating from a safety perspective across the Washington, Oregon region. Our other witnesses, Captain Scott Jackson, retired. He's got currently he retired a year ago, 2 years ago, and got a humble job with Texas A&M University Corps of Cadets, currently the Strategic Support and Engagement Managing Director. So a small job. He's an alum of Texas A&M, and another guy with it has deep experience in the Pacific Northwest. He started as an Army aviator, and like all of the very best Coast Guard aviators, we stole him from the Army. It's really quite a feat to be able to do that. Land helicopter piloting is such a different business than landing on ships and doing all of that kind of work. And he really excelled. And let me give you just a quick rundown. He retired out of Air Station Astoria, but he has been all over the nation, but really heavily in the Pacific Northwest, including Port Angeles. He was the District 14 Command Center Chief. He is a Jayhawk pilot, although he flew helicopters out of Air Station Houston, the mighty 65, as they call it, the Wine of Freedom. But he's got something on the order of 5,000 cumulative flight hours, most of that in the Jayhawk. He has flown from Kodiak and did the Royal Navy Exchange Program, so he understands the Sea King and Mark V and all of those capabilities as well. Truly an expert, and I will conclude my introduction of him by saying that he had one of the harder jobs that we can ask. He was both in command of Sector Columbia River and instrumental in the specialization, separation of that into a sector and an air station again, which is a little bit of Back to the Future, but really focused on the incredible proficiency and focus that aviation in the Pacific Northwest requires. So with that, I'll cede and thank our witnesses for coming today.
Admiral, it's great to see you, sir. And I do remember you. Absolute privilege to be here with all of y'all today. I don't know if Dan's already on. I saw him just a moment ago.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Hey, Dan. Hey, it's good to see you too.
You too, Captain. Good to see you again.
Dan, I don't know. I'm happy to go first, or you can go first. However you want to skin this cat.
Be my guest.
I'll tell you what. I'll go first then because I'm ready to start presenting here. But again, like the Admiral said, a little bit of background on the Pacific coast there. Multiple tours, multiple chances, opportunities to fly helicopters, and had the distinct privileges of working with a lot of aviators and a lot of surfmen up there in the challenges of the Pacific Northwest. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Let me know if y'all are actually seeing something on your end. Okay. I think you're seeing it, are you?
We got it, Scott.
Okay, fantastic. So I know I was asked to talk about specifically about aviation ops from a multi-mission perspective here, but and how we tie into offshore wind energy, and then some of our concerns here. You got my background. Let me switch to the next slide here. Are you seeing persistent aviation SAR challenges?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I'm not seeing what you're seeing, so I apologize here. So at the end of the day, lots of challenges. Every minute counts in an emergency. Most of our SAR assets in this situation are based near shore, and our current footprint is based on our historical SAR. And before you right there, some of the unique challenges that the Pacific Coast has to offer for our aviators. The distance being probably one of the most critical ones, rugged coastal terrain, which has a big impact on access. You can see a couple snapshots there I put in the background. The fog, the persistent low ceilings. You don't see the rough sea state, maybe a little bit in that photo on the right, but there's a reason why our Advanced Helicopter Rescue School is there on the Pacific Coast. It's because of the unique challenges that the Pacific has to offer that maybe you're not going to see everywhere else, other than maybe Alaska and certainly in the North Sea. Limited infrastructure, navigation gaps. You're seeing some of the stuff there. Everything's rugged and remote. The weather conditions are to the extremes that we'll see and that we operate in from a helicopter perspective, which create their own challenges, whether it's those navigation gaps, those dead zones by terrain influence. And then, you also on there have crew fatigue. Those long distance cases, multi-mission crews that, this is crews are not just going out there and doing search and rescue. They're doing law enforcement. They're doing pollution flights. They're doing safety patrols. They're doing harbor security. They're doing everything, all the mission sets that the Coast Guard has to offer, so that can build up crew fatigue. And with a limited number of resources, and the longer distance we're talking, and then the additional risks that we're talking about, it certainly makes for challenges that you're not going to face everywhere in the other than the Pacific. So I want to talk a little bit about this kind of as a graphic that shows some of the very unique challenges that we have with helicopter access if we start putting the offshore wind environment into the situation. We'll talk about radar interference in a second. We'll talk about some restricted hoist zones, turbulence being a key factor, but you just saw that screen in front of you that shows the low visibility concerns that the Pacific Northwest has. So this one shows you some of the key radar effects on wind turbines. The bottom line, wind turbines present a significant radar-related challenge for helicopter operations up there, particularly for search and rescue, as those large metallic turbine blades combined with their constant rotation create electromagnetic reflections that will stand to disrupt that radar functionality. And what that does for us is it impairs target detection as well as our situational awareness out there. Some of those effects can include a variety of things like radar clutter and false echoes, because those moving blades are generating unpredictable reflections. And then those false echoes can obscure real search and rescue targets that we have out there, like life rafts or if we're looking for people in the water, vessels, and that sort of thing. It also potentially masks targets. Whether they're small objects, they can be hidden behind that radar clutter. And it reduces that effectiveness for surface search near turbine fields. You're going to probably hear a lot of this from Dan as well once he comes online. Doppler ambiguity, turbine blade rotation causes Doppler shifts that mimic moving targets. So what might be a stationary target because of that Doppler shift and that blade effect on it, it's going to show that I've got a moving target out there. And it leads to confusion between actual moving vessels and what you would see as blade returns on the radar screen for the aircraft. It's also going to provide multipath and beam distortion. So you're going to get some beam reflections between the turbines, which cause ghost images back behind it. You can kind of see that on the backside of that. And it also creates bearing inaccuracies. Results in difficulty locating our search and rescue targets as we're out there, as I stated earlier. And then, of course, while not really tied to AIS, radar clutter can complicate AIS target verification because small craft without AIS are particularly vulnerable to being masked. So you'd have to, indirectly, it could be affected if you tied both together. Some of the mitigation strategies, I know, I mean, after reading about this in the past, but are using radar absorbent materials and turbines, which could lower blade reflection, radar shadow modeling designs. It could maintain clear corridors for radar if you were out there. Some of the other mitigation factors, visual and AIS target confirmation. Of course, that PEN's having good visibility out there, but it gives you a dual source validation of targets, and then dedicated hoist zones and safe corridors, which reduce clutter during helicopter ops. So the other thing that we were talking about earlier are those turbulent wakes that are created. Offshore wind turbines generate significant wake turbulence, creating critical safety hazards for helicopter operations. And these certainly affect all different mission sets that Coast Guard or any offshore helicopter operators would be facing. And without proper planning, turbulence can certainly jeopardize pilot control, passenger safety, or mission success of whatever mission's being done out there. Some of those turbulence hazards, you can kind of see a pictorial graphic here, blade tip vortices. Those wakes coming off of those rotors on the wind turbines will extend up to 10 rotor diameters out away from those and downwind of the wind turbines. They're shedding tip vortices, which create those turbulent air downwind wakes from each turbine. And when I say 10 rotor diameters downwind, you can figure that's easily over a mile downwind for the large modern turbines. Hover instability, if you're downwind of that turbulent, obviously could impair helicopter control, dangerous hoist operations, especially in confined turbine fields, if you're dealing with that hover instability. Airframe vibration, structural stresses on the assets if you find yourself in that disturbed airflow, and it would certainly increase the fatigue on those helicopter components. And then you can imagine the workload, the pilot workload and disorientation if I'm constantly making corrections while I'm flying the helicopter in light of all that turbulence that's going on. Now you'll see that around fixed objects, you'll see that around orographic turbulence and terrain, but a lot of that is increased with wake turbulence because you got little, those larger turbines, there are fewer natural obstructions to dissipate the turbulence if you're talking the offshore environment. And then there's obviously collision risk. Any kind of turbulence can push an aircraft towards turbine towers or blades, especially in tight layouts if you've got a field that's laid out very tightly. And why is it offshore? Could it be severe? Again, because those expansive wakes could go out for miles, open sea conditions where fewer obstacles, and then of course atmospheric stratification offshore can trap wake effects for extended periods of time as well. And there's a lot of mitigation strategies that could be put in place, whether it's substation helidecks, rotor stop agreements, steering SAR, a lot of these type of things you'll already see in place from some of our international communities that are out there that are already dealing with this and providing safety for helicopter operations. So obviously key issues, it's an increased search and rescue risk out there from that offshore construction. At the end of the day, the Coast Guard is going to always be the lead SAR authority, but the current footprint, it wasn't designed for large scale offshore construction and maintenance. And with potentially thousands of more people working offshore, as you can imagine, every minute's going to count. And as I stated earlier, this is really on top of the Coast Guard's existing mission sets, and increased offshore ops will stretch resources that we already have then. That said, I have every faith in our Coast Guard helicopter crews and pilots out there. They're the best that you're ever going to have. And it's not a question of their capability, but it's going to be really a question when it comes to the Coast Guard of coverage, speed, and then access. So how do we mitigate that? And I apologize if it's hard to read some of that. I probably didn't pick the best font here. My war college professors would not be happy with me. But mitigation. Now, I'm not saying here, I'll let you read that, not saying to build a Coast Guard base tomorrow, but you will certainly need a layered model, and you need to understand the risks and plan for it. This offers some mitigation opportunities. The Coast Guard will always lead from a search and rescue standpoint, but I'd say the developers must plan, equip, fund initial response capabilities. And then we need to be thinking forward about emergency rescue and recovery vehicles, helidecs, joint drills, shared comms, all those things. And we must accept there will be instances of potentially delayed responses. And I'll say that depending on the tightness of the fields and stuff, if it's nasty weather and you can't see anything out there and I'm dealing with radar returns, there may be some instances where the Coast Guard, the risk is going to outweigh the gain. And then I'll wrap up with this. Offshore wind, we all know it's going to continue to grow, and that SAR planning and understanding the risks and mitigating those are going to go and have to grow right alongside it. And I would say, you know, as I'm sure everybody in this room is probably thinking about, a hybrid model of public authority and private sector support is certainly going to be the way forward. Happy to take any of your questions, but I suspect if I don't know how you want to break out the questions here. I can answer questions from the aviation perspective, or we can do Dan's presentation and then answer them together if that's what you'd rather do. Over.
Why don't we proceed with Dan's presentation and then we'll answer, because they'll overlap to a certain extent, and then we'll ask both of you questions at the end.
Sounds great. Let me quit sharing here. There we go. All right, over to you, Dan.
Oh, great. Thank you, everyone, for the invite for this. And I'm kind of excited a little bit to change to my what I call hull history that the Admiral brought up, is that I retired again here a year and a half ago from the boating safety position at District 13 for 20 years of that. So I actually have 43 years of service with the Coast Guard, both civilian and active duty. The other thing, I appreciate the advancement, but unless they're going to give me warrant pay, I'll stick with that. But I retired as a Master Chief, so it's one of those great things. I think, well, my whole entire life's been with the Coast Guard, so to move forward, it's always fun to have the aviators go first because they have all kinds of nice pictures and stuff, and they do have your presentation for you. Looking over the criteria for this, I'm going to kind of move toward a little bit about a bit of the environment that the boat operator has to deal with when it comes to this, some current policy and regulatory policy that we have along the Oregon and Washington coast. Maybe discuss a little bit some of the major accidents that that we've had in the past that could be affected by this if they could reoccur. And then talk a little bit about the civilian usage around the area, and then also get into a few small operational issues, kind of like what the captain had mentioned. But we live on our coast in a lee shore environment. And what I mean by that is that all of our weather in the Northern Hemisphere goes from west to east. So our weather is quite different on this side of the United States than it is on the East Coast, because predominantly the weather patterns go towards the offshore instead of the onshore. Our weather patterns, and especially sea conditions, they're created hundreds and thousands of miles away from us, across the Pacific, over into the Eastern Pacific, Gulf of Alaska, and they all converge on the coastline unabated. So there's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of height and stuff to all these conditions and these storms. We get some pretty significant storms out here. One in case back in the 80s when I was at Depot Bay, we had a storm blow through where the gusts on the coast were at 114 miles an hour with sustained gusts at 95 to 98 miles an hour. So when those things hit, they flat blow through the area, and they create a lot of havoc, not only shoreside, but also in the marine environment. With that lee shore, all of our assets and stuff, when we get into those situations, we're pretty much in a non-operational mood. The only thing that we have in those cases are the aircraft, and if they can fly in the conditions present. I've known of several situations to where we've had some pretty rough stuff, but because of that, in the Oregon and Washington coast area, the Coast Guard back in 1974 instituted regulatory rulemaking to create a process to which we could restrict the movement of recreational and small passenger vessels, six-pack vessels, from crossing the bar when certain conditions exist. That authority came from 33 CFR 177.11, which was held in subchapter S of the boating safety regulations as a hazardous condition. We operated with that for quite some time. Our challenges were not so great then, as that we just spent a lot of time underway shepherding people in and out across the bars and being on the bar when the weather was rough, and the level of safety awareness had to go up just because of the conditions. As time went on with us on the coast with personnel issues and stuff, we kind of moved away from all the strenuous man-hour policies that we had at the coastal stations. In 2007, we had an accident on the Tillamook Bay Bar with the charter vessel Tacky 2. Now, this is a situation and let me jump back a little bit. When we get these weather conditions that rise up like this, it's severe, especially on the bars and all up and down the coast. And so when the Tacky 2 capsized going outbound at Tillamook, there was 11 fatalities on that case, and the NTSB got involved in that. Come about 2010, the 13th district went and finally changed the regulations out of the boating safety section of the CFRs into the regulated navigation areas. Gives more teeth to being able to restrict or even close a bar, and it gives the captain of the port the authority to do so under specific conditions. And basically, those conditions are when the lifeboats exceed their operational capabilities, which is 20-foot breaking seas. So if the surf on the bar hits 20 feet, then the boats don't go out. So in the situation to where you have all this offshore construction and infrastructure and stuff, there may be times to where we won't let boats move. You could have breakdowns. You could get people stuck offshore. There's a host of things that could come into play just strictly because of the weather conditions that are present. And you'll see these weather conditions mostly between October and right now, April, May, throughout the winter. So it gets quite significant. The regulation now where the RNA is in 33 CFR 164.1325. And basically these RNAs aren't just exactly right at the entrance. They encompass a larger area even outside the bar. So, we could, the captain of the port can restrict that and you have no vessels, either commercial or anything going out across the bars. To highlight some of the cases that we've had in the past of larger shipping, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be a significant amount of infrastructure involved with this offshore wind stuff, is that probably most people remember in 1999, the 340-foot bulk carrier New Carissa drug anchor and ended up on the beach at Coos Bay, breaking in half, very large oil spill, and removal process that made national news. They were anchored 1.5 miles offshore. This would be a situation that we would, some of the anchors offshore for vessels that are larger vessels coming into the ports may have to go way far offshore and just loiter rather than being able to anchor up. And if they break down, they could drift through these areas. And when you look at this, especially with the New Carissa and then another one I'll mention here in a minute, but rescue tug assistance for vessels that size, large barges and things like that, can't be just pulled out of thin air along the Oregon and Washington coast. They would have to come out of San Francisco or out of the Puget Sound area, which is a time-consuming event. One of those situations happened at the same time the New Carissa was going on. When I was at Tillamook, we had a C-span barge that was 246 feet, break loose from tow, about 17 miles offshore, and started drifting northeast. And it took them 2 days to be able to get a tug out, to be able to try to hook up to it, to tow it. And they actually got a hold of it less than 1 mile offshore, just southwest of Cannon Beach, Oregon. So we had another potential there of having a very large vessel drifting up even onto the beach, and we skirted with disaster. In 1983, a 360-foot bulk carrier called the Blue Magpie was transiting from San Francisco up to Vancouver, BC, and got caught in a very, very severe storm. And the captain got scared, thought he was going to capsize, ended up turning it in and wanted to cross at Yaquina Bay. Against Coast Guard directions, he still did it. He ended up on the North Jetty. There's still parts of the hulk of that vessel sitting inside the North Reef, north of Yaquina Bay. On the bottom, they tried to get as much out as they could. So there's always the potential of having something like that take place, especially with the amount of large vessel traffic, tugs and barges transiting within the coast. Now, I understand there'll be zones and all that stuff, but in these situations where you have this heavy weather and they break loose or whatever, you're pretty limited on, at least we are, on our ability to respond for that. The only Coast Guard assets that we have along the Oregon and Washington coast are the 47-foot motor lifeboats that we have at the stations, and now they are bringing in the 154-foot fast response cutters. I don't have any towing statistics or anything or information on the fast response cutters, but the 47s only have a 50 deadweight ton towing capacity. And so when situations like that, other than small boats, they're pretty much fairly useless with that. So there'll be 440 or 154s at Astoria, I think one at Coos Bay, one up at Port Angeles, and then there'll be one in Crescent City again, is where all the other patrol boat cutters are located. The 47 is also limited on range. It's 150-mile range. They don't let them pretty much go past 50 miles. I don't know how far the wind fields are going to extend that they're looking at. But we're restricted on endurance, and once again, we're restricted on weather conditions if they get that severe. On the civilian side, activity-wise, salmon fishing starts about June, and that is all waters pretty much up and down the Oregon and Washington coast, depending on where you have an opening set by Fish and Wildlife, and they could be anywhere from the beach out to 12, maybe 15 miles fishing for salmon. And that lasts clear up into August, sometimes even into September, depending